An independent autopsy has been released into the death of George Floyd, an African-American man who died in police custody. Here's one of the forensic pathologists who conducted the autopsy.
The evidence is consistent with mechanical asphyxia as the cause of death and homicide as the manner of death.
We're going to show you some disturbing footage in a moment of George Floyd's arrest, an event which sparked the worst racial and civil unrest in America for generations. It was this footage that went viral, showing 3 police officers kneeling on the unarmed Mr Floyd with the white police officer Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck. Mr Floyd can be heard saying, "Please, I can't breathe," several times. Mr Chauvin has been charged with killing George Floyd. A scheduled court appearance for him has been delayed by a week. Ben Crump is a civil rights attorney acting on behalf of the Floyd family.
George died because he needed a breath. He needed a breath of air. So I implore you all to join his family in taking a breath for justice, taking a breath for peace, taking a breath for our country, but more importantly, taking a breath for George.
Ben Crump there, who is representing the Floyd family. Another part of that legal team is his co-counsel, Antonio Ramonucci, speaking about the other police officers who were at the scene but who have not been charged.
Not only was the knee on George's neck a cause of his death, but so was the weight of the other 2 police officers on his back, who not only prevented blood flow into his brain, but also airflow into his lungs. That makes all of those officers on scene criminally liable and without a doubt civilly responsible.
Let's get analysis for you. Neda Tawfik is in New York for us.
Well, I think officials like those here in New York would be particularly concerned about that information further fueling anger here over the death of George Floyd. You can see stores behind me that have been vandalized, have been victims to looting, already preparing for another night. But it's important to note that the family's independent autopsy challenges the preliminary one from the medical examiner, that official autopsy, which said that really there was no physical evidence of traumatic asphyxia or strangulation, even though the combined effects of restraint with Mr. Floyd's underlying health conditions and possible toxins in his system basically contributed to his death. Here, the family's doctors, the attorneys were very clear that they thought this was a homicide by asphyxia. They say that that ambulance was essentially a hearse for Mr. Floyd, who they believe died right there on the scene. He was found without a pulse after the incident.
Neda Tawfik there in New York. Well, earlier in Minneapolis, George Floyd's brother Terrence spoke at the scene of his arrest.
In every case of police brutality, the same thing has been happening. Y'all protest, y'all destroy stuff, and they don't move. You know why they don't move? Because it's not their stuff, it's our stuff. So they want us to destroy our stuff. They're not going to move. Listen. So let's do this another way.
That's right. Come on now, bro.
Let's do this another way.
The brother there of George Floyd, Terrence Floyd. Well, protests, many of them violent, have spread to more than 75 cities across America. What many are describing as the country's worst racial and civil unrest since the 1960s. In Portland, Oregon, police clashed with demonstrators using tear gas and stun grenades in an attempt to disperse the crowd. Fires were also seen burning in the streets. In New York, chaos erupted in the borough of Manhattan with piles of rubbish set on fire, and protesters threw bottles and other objects at police officers armed with batons. In the Soho district, as you can see here, looters smashed windows and stole from many of the upmarket stores there. And this was Minneapolis, the city where George Floyd died while being detained by police. Protesters were forced to run for cover when a truck drove at high speed at the demonstrators after having apparently breached a barricade. Quite extraordinary scenes unfolding there in Minneapolis. Several thousand people had been marching along the major highway route from the site where George Floyd lost his life. In Louisville, Kentucky, the Army and National Guard blocked off streets during the protests over the deaths of Breonna Taylor, who was killed there by police, and also in protest over the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Arrests were made and many people were detained there. And elsewhere, looting broke out in stores in LA. The suburb of Santa Monica was a focal point for much of the demonstrations there. And in Philadelphia, stores were ransacked and police officers in riot gear and armoured vehicle used pepper spray to try to repel both looters and rioters. Well, large-scale protests also took place in Denver, Atlanta, Boston, Miami and Oklahoma City. And it doesn't end there. This is the scene live in New York, where it's approaching 10 minutes past 4 in 3 even in the afternoon. Times Square, 10 minutes past 4 indeed. In fact, sorry, just put the wrong location there. We're looking at New York Times Square, where they were gathered there an hour or so ago, listening to the results of that independent autopsy that was announced in Minneapolis. And you heard many chants, many cheers, applause and anger and fist pumps there, as tensions are indeed heightened as many were listening to the results from the doctors saying that George Floyd died of mechanical asphyxia. That was the cause of death, which is respiration prevented by external pressure on the body. That of the police officer, Derek Chauvin. But they went on to say in that press conference that the other officers at the scene would be culpable, in their opinion, of homicide as well. We haven't had a direct response from the Minneapolis Police Department, but the legal team representing George Floyd made the point that this is not just about an unarmed black man against a white police officer. This is about systemic racism and also Minneapolis Police Department in their handling of how this has unfolded, and years, they said, of racist actions against the community there. But as we said, we're waiting to hear a reaction from the Minneapolis Police Department. But this is seen live in New York as protests are expected again for a 7th night. And we've just heard on a number of news agencies that the New York mayor has said that a curfew will be imposed at 11 o'clock p.m. local time in New York to try and curb the protests there and to try and quash any violent protests that may unfold. Well, across the country, there have been claims that some police officers are using excessive force to disperse those protesters, as we were saying. And this happened in LA. A patrol car was caught on camera driving, as you can see, into at least 2 people before reversing and leaving the crowded area. Shocking scenes there. We've been told that the police are conducting a full investigation into that incident. It's one of many that have been captured on social media, on camera, of course. Here's more from the New York Governor, Andrew Cuomo.
Some of the videos, frankly, are inexplicable to me. What do we do about it? I've asked the Attorney General, who is an independent elected official, to review the police conduct activities in the protests last night, the night before, if there's one tonight. If that review looks at those videos and finds that there was improper police conduct, there will be ramifications.
Well, President Trump today has continued to dismiss the protesters as left-wing extremists and has rounded on America's state governors over what he called their weak response to the violence that has erupted since the death of George Floyd. Barbara Pett-Usher is in Minneapolis.
It's 1 week ago that George Floyd was killed at this area, and this is where a memorial has been set up, and people have been coming to reflect on that and also on the tumultuous week since. But Mr. Trump is not doing any reflection, it seems. He's speaking very bluntly. He told governors that they were weak because they had not more forcefully aggressively put in law and order at the weekend. He said that they needed to dominate, otherwise the protesters would run all over them and, quote, make them look like a bunch of jerks. And he said that Washington would see an intensification of security forces over the coming day. He said, we're going to clamp down very, very strongly. And this is really, a president under siege.
Barbara Plett-Usher reporting there.